The sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoed through the packed hall of the Silver Creek Community Center. 7-year-old Emma Carter clutched her pink ceramic piggy bank tightly, coins rattling softly inside as tears blurred her vision. Her heart pounded painfully, each beat resonating with the rising bids. $40,000, announced the auctioneer, his voice booming with authority. Do I hear 45? Emma's trembling gaze followed the bidding paddles rising swiftly, each upward motion slicing through her hope like a merciless blade. Across the crowded room stood Max, her father's canine partner, a strong German shepherd whose loyal eyes scanned the audience restlessly. The dog's ears suddenly perked, his gaze locking onto Emma's tiny figure. With a sudden and desperate lunge, Max tugged sharply at his leash, startling his handler. A low, urgent whine broke through the murmuring crowd as Max strained toward the girl. The handler pulled back, regaining control, but the room had already witnessed the undeniable connection between the child and the dog. Margaret Carter gently wrapped an arm around her daughter's thin shoulders, squeezing softly as fresh tears spilled down Emma's cheeks. This auction wasn't merely about acquiring a pet. It represented Emma's only living bond to her father, Deputy Sheriff David Carter, who had been tragically killed in the line of duty 5 years earlier. Since that heartbreaking day, Emma hadn't spoken to anyone except Max, her father's loyal companion. $50,000, called out a man near the front, his voice carrying a decisive edge. Emma's breath caught, fear tightening her chest. She knew they couldn't compete with such amounts. Rick Thompson, Emma's stepfather, shifted uneasily beside them, his face betraying a flicker of relief Emma couldn't yet understand. Rick believed Max was keeping Emma trapped in her grief. Margaret, however, knew better. Emma's tiny hands shook violently, coins clinking within the fragile piggy bank. She had saved every penny since her father's passing, hoping that someday it would be enough to bring Max home. $55,000, came another voice, James Hammond, owner of a prominent security firm, clearly determined to win. Emma looked helplessly at her mother, her eyes wide with panic and despair. Margaret gently brushed Emma's tears away, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. "It's okay, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, though her voice trembled, betraying her own anxiety. "We'll find another way." Yet Emma knew the truth. Max wasn't just a dog. He was the only connection she had left to her father, the only soul she had spoken to in 5 long, silent years. Her grip on the piggy bank tightened as hope faded into the painful ache of loss. Suddenly, a quiet voice broke the escalating tension from the back of the hall. $60,000, the voice said calmly, carrying a note of finality that drew every eye. Emma turned to see Steve Bennett, a quiet, reserved rancher known to be wealthy but rarely seen participating in public affairs. Margaret caught her breath, confusion and curiosity flashing across her face. She had no idea why someone like Bennett would involve himself, but a fragile thread of hope began weaving through her heart. The hall fell silent, every breath held as the auctioneer paused, scanning the room. Hammond's jaw tightened visibly, but he said nothing. $60,000, repeated the auctioneer, his voice ringing clear. Going once, going twice, sold. Applause erupted, yet the sound barely penetrated Emma's thoughts as reality slowly sank in. Bennett had won the bid, but what did that mean for Max? And for her? As Emma clutched the cold ceramic tighter, she locked eyes with Max once more. The dog stood perfectly still, gazing back with solemn recognition, as if understanding all too well the uncertainty hanging between them. Emma silently prayed that this wasn't goodbye. Emma sat quietly by her bedroom window, staring at the gently falling snow that blanketed Silver Creek. The room was filled with memories, each object a silent reminder of better times. Her fingers absently brushed the soft fur of a worn stuffed animal, its eyes faded from years of comfort. Margaret stood silently in the doorway, her heart aching as she watched her daughter. 5 years had passed, yet the pain of losing David felt just as raw. David Carter had been the soul of their small family, an officer deeply respected in Silver Creek. He and Max, his canine partner, had been inseparable, sharing a bond that everyone admired. Margaret still remembered vividly the day their world shattered. A routine drug bust had spiraled out of control, taking David's life. Max had survived, but something changed in him afterward. A part of the dog had seemed lost alongside David. And soon after, Emma had slowly slipped into silence, speaking only to Max, her words hidden from everyone else. In the years following David's death, Margaret struggled to hold their lives together. Rick Thompson had entered their lives 2 years later, providing stability and comfort. Initially, Margaret had hoped his presence would help Emma heal. But Rick couldn't fully understand the bond between Emma and Max. To him, the dog symbolized the past, anchoring Emma in her grief. One evening, Margaret overheard Rick talking quietly on the phone in the kitchen. She paused near the doorway, her pulse quickening when she heard the name James Hammond. Hammond ran a private security company and had openly expressed interest in acquiring Max for commercial purposes. "I'll talk to Margaret again," Rick said quietly into the phone, his voice strained. "But I can't promise anything." Margaret stepped into the kitchen as Rick hung up, folding his arms defensively. "Who was that?" she asked, her tone guarded. Rick sighed. "James Hammond. He still wants Max. He says it would give the dog purpose, structure." Margaret's expression hardened. "Max has a purpose, Emma. He's the only one who truly understands her." Rick shook his head, frustration evident in his eyes. "But that's the problem, Margaret. Emma isn't healing. Maybe Max is keeping her trapped in the past." Margaret felt a flare of anger. Max is the only connection Emma has left to her father. If we take that away, she might lose herself completely. Rick looked away, his jaw tight. "I'm worried about her too. But it's been 5 years. We have to consider other options." Before Margaret could reply, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Hello." A deep voice replied. "Mrs. Carter? This is Steve Bennett. We haven't met, but I think we need to talk." Steve Bennett was known around Silver Creek, a wealthy but reclusive rancher. His sudden interest caught Margaret off guard. "About what?" she asked wearily. "About Max," he replied, "and about James Hammond." Intrigued yet cautious, Margaret agreed to meet him at the local diner that afternoon. As snow lightly dusted her shoulders, she stepped inside, quickly spotting Bennett in a booth near the back. He stood politely, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming," he said gently. Once seated, Bennett got straight to the point. "I know you're wondering why someone like me would involve himself in your family situation. But Hammond's interest in Max goes deeper than business." Margaret tensed. "What do you mean?" Bennett's eyes darkened slightly. "Your husband was investigating Meridian Pharmaceuticals when he died, wasn't he?" Margaret's breath caught. David had indeed mentioned an important case shortly before his death, though he'd spared her the details. Bennett continued solemnly. "My daughter, Jessica, worked at Meridian. She discovered dangerous practices and reported them. 3 weeks later, she died in a suspicious accident. David was investigating her case." Margaret felt chills run down her spine. "Are you saying Hammond is connected to all this?" Bennett nodded slowly. "Hammond's firm recently secured a large security contract with Meridian. Max was trained to detect specific chemicals Meridian was secretly using. Hammond wants Max because he's evidence, a threat to his new client's interests." Margaret's heart raced. Suddenly, the threat seemed very real, very close. "I had no idea," she whispered. "Few people do," Bennett said gently. "But Max represents something far greater than any of us realized." As Margaret returned home, her mind swirled with fear and determination. She couldn't let Hammond win. Not when Max meant so much to Emma and held keys to the justice David had fought for. Inside the house, Margaret found Emma curled up quietly on the couch, clutching a framed picture of David and Max. Margaret sat beside her daughter, gently brushing Emma's hair from her face. "I promise you, Emma," Margaret whispered softly, her voice firm. "We'll bring Max home." Emma looked up, her eyes searching Margaret's face for reassurance. Though silent, her expression spoke clearly, expressing trust. Margaret vowed never to break. In that quiet moment, Margaret realized they weren't just fighting for a dog. They were fighting for Emma's voice, their family's healing, and the truth that David had sacrificed everything for. Max was their key, a symbol of loyalty that extended beyond duty, reaching deeply into their hearts, binding them together even in their pain. Margaret felt her breath hitch as she stared at the email open on her laptop screen. The words blurred momentarily, and she forced herself to focus again. Her heart sank deeper with each line she read. A clear betrayal written in black and white. It was a message from Hammond's assistant thanking Rick for his continued assistance in persuading locals to withdraw their support from Margaret's campaign. Margaret's hands trembled as disbelief and anger surged inside her. Her husband was deliberately sabotaging their fight to bring Max home. She glanced toward Emma's room, a fierce protectiveness rising within her. Emma had already lost so much. The idea that Rick, someone she trusted, would actively undermine Emma's healing felt unbearable. Margaret rose quietly, clutching the printed email, and found Rick in the kitchen. He stood by the counter sipping coffee, oblivious to her anger. Margaret slammed the email onto the countertop, startling him. "What is this, Rick?" Her voice was cold, shaking with suppressed fury. Rick scanned the paper, then sighed deeply. He rubbed his temples, as if preparing himself for the inevitable confrontation. "It's not what you think," he said, though guilt flickered in his eyes. "Not what I think," Margaret snapped, her voice sharp. "You're deliberately turning people against our family, against Emma." "I'm trying to help," Rick shot back defensively. "Can't you see? Emma's attachment to Max isn't healthy. Hammond can provide Max a proper environment. Emma needs to move on." Margaret stared incredulously. "Max is her lifeline. He's all she has left from her father, and you're helping Hammond rip that away from her." Rick avoided her gaze, his voice low and weary. "I'm not trying to hurt her, but this obsession is tearing us apart. It's destroying our chance at a normal life." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but her voice remained steady, filled with quiet determination. "Emma's healing is our life. If you can't understand that, maybe you don't belong here." The weight of her words hung heavily between them, unspoken consequences echoing loudly in their silence. Rick simply nodded, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he finally said quietly, leaving the room without another word. Hours later, Margaret sat at the small diner in Silver Creek across from Steve Bennett, clutching a steaming cup of coffee. The rancher listened quietly as Margaret explained the latest developments. "Hammond is using Rick to sabotage us," she said, her voice strained. "And he's succeeding. Several big donors withdrew their pledges today." Bennett's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Hammond's reach is extensive, but he's reckless. He's counting on you folding under pressure." Margaret's gaze sharpened, determined. "I won't fold, but I need your help, Mr. Bennett. I can't fight this battle alone." He nodded solemnly. "Call me Steve. We both have personal stakes here, Margaret. We'll see this through together." A waitress approached, refilling their coffees and smiling softly as she stepped away. Bennett leaned forward slightly. "I've arranged a meeting tomorrow with someone who might provide critical evidence against Hammond and Meridian," Bennett said quietly. "But it won't be easy. We must tread carefully." Margaret agreed immediately. The possibility of finding justice, of giving meaning to David's sacrifice, filled her with renewed purpose. That night, Margaret sat beside Emma on her bed. The child held tightly to the small police badge her father once wore. Margaret gently touched her daughter's shoulder, feeling the tension beneath her fingers. "Emma, sweetheart, tomorrow I'm going to meet someone who might help us bring Max home," she said softly. Emma's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope in their depths. Her lips parted as if she might speak, but no words emerged. Instead, she squeezed her mother's hand tightly, a silent promise of trust. The following afternoon, Margaret found herself standing alongside Bennett outside an old farmhouse on the edge of town. A weatherman named Tom Abrams greeted them, ushering them inside cautiously. Abrams, a former Meridian Pharmaceuticals employee, had worked alongside Bennett's daughter. Nervously, he handed Bennett a stack of documents. These show unauthorized chemical experiments, Abrams said, glancing around anxiously. Your daughter was killed because she found out too much. Deputy Carter and Max got too close. Hammond knows Max's evidence. He won't stop. Margaret's heart pounded as she examined the papers. David had died protecting these secrets. Now she held the key to justice and Emma's future in her hands. Abrams looked at Margaret, his expression grave. This isn't just about your dog or your daughter, ma'am. These people are dangerous. If they find out I spoke to you. Margaret met his gaze steadily, feeling a fierce resolve within her. I won't let them hurt anyone else. Not again. Later that evening, Margaret returned home, placing the documents securely in a locked drawer. She walked quietly to Emma's room, finding her asleep, clutching David's badge tightly. Margaret gently smoothed her daughter's hair, whispering a silent vow to protect her at all costs. Downstairs, Rick sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen. He looked up, eyes heavy with regret. Margaret sat across from him, the silence stretching between them. I made a terrible mistake, Rick admitted softly. I thought removing Max would help Emma let go, but I've only made things worse. Margaret's voice remained gentle but firm. If you truly want to fix this, then stand with us now. Support Emma and Max, not Hammond. Rick nodded slowly, his expression earnest. I will, whatever it takes. Margaret rose, pausing briefly at the doorway. I hope you mean it, Rick, because right now, trust is all we have left. That night, as snow continued to blanket Silver Creek, Margaret lay awake, her thoughts heavy yet clear. She knew the battle ahead would be difficult and dangerous. But as she listened to Emma's gentle breathing through the thin wall separating their rooms, Margaret knew exactly why she would fight, no matter the cost. Emma deserved healing. David deserved justice. And Max deserved to come home. The sun rose pale and cold over Silver Creek, the kind of morning that seemed too still before a storm. Inside the Carter home, Emma sat at the kitchen table in her best dress, her tiny fingers clutched around a chipped pink piggy bank. She hadn't spoken since the night before, but her determination was louder than any words. Her eyes never left the window, waiting. Margaret moved around the kitchen with nervous energy, fixing Emma's hair into 2 neat braids, hands trembling slightly. Rick lingered by the door, the tension between them eased by a fragile truce. He had done the unthinkable, withdrawn his support from Hammond, and donated the last of his savings to Emma's cause. They drove in silence to the Silver Creek Community Center, where the annual law enforcement auction was already bustling. News crews had set up outside. Inside, rows of chairs filled quickly with donors, reporters, and town officials. But Emma had eyes only for Max. The moment Officer Reynolds led Max into the hall, the German shepherd's ears pricked up, nose twitching. He scanned the crowd until his gaze landed on Emma and froze. The dog's body stiffened, then relaxed into a tail wag and a soft whine. The crowd noticed. Cameras clicked. Someone whispered, "That's her. That's the Carter girl." Margaret gripped Emma's hand. "Stay close, sweetheart," she whispered. The auction began with the usual fanfare, gift baskets, vacation vouchers, memorabilia. But the energy shifted when the auctioneer, a broad-shouldered man in a suit 2 sizes too tight, stepped up and announced the final item. Next up, K9 Max, 7 years old. Trained in narcotics detection, search and rescue, and suspect apprehension. Starting bid, $2, $500. Margaret raised her paddle immediately. Do I hear $3,000? The auctioneer called. A paddle went up. James Hammond, slick in his navy suit, seated beside 2 of his associates. He didn't even look at Emma. $3,000 from bidder 42. $3,500. Steve Bennett raised his hand. The bidding moved fast. 4,000. 4,000. 5, $6. Rick put a hand on Margaret's shoulder as she raised their final bid. $6,000. Emma opened her piggy bank quietly beside her, counting out her coins, laying each dollar and cent on her lap with shaking hands. $7,000, Hammond called. Bennett didn't flinch. $10,000. A hush fell over the room. The numbers were rising faster than expected. Margaret sat frozen. Hammond leaned toward the auctioneer. $12,500. Bennett raised again. $15,000. Murmurs swept through the hall. Margaret's chest tightened. This was beyond anything they had left. $20,000, Hammond barked. A pause. Then Bennett stood. $35,000. Gasps erupted. The auctioneer blinked.
35,000 from bidder 28 roller here for 1,000.
Hammond hesitated. One of his associates leaned in, whispering urgently. He raised his paddle again. $45,000. Emma's small voice suddenly pierced the tension. Wait. Every head turned. Emma stood, holding up her pink piggy bank with both hands, her voice shaky but clear. I want to add my money. The auctioneer hesitated. Miss, this is an adult event. She's a bidder, Bennett interrupted calmly. And this is her savings. Emma walked into the aisle, her little shoes clicking on the wooden floor. Max stood now alert, watching her every step. Officer Reynolds gripped his leash, but the dog didn't move. Emma held up a $1 bill. This is everything I have. Please, he's not just a dog. He's my dad's partner. He's all I have left. The room fell silent. Even Hammond looked caught off guard. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Current high bid is $45,000. Do I hear more? Bennett raised his paddle. $60,000. Hammond stood stiffly. $70,000. But before the auctioneer could respond, Max broke his sit-stay command. He pulled hard against the leash, stepping down from the stage and moving directly toward Emma. Reynolds tried to restrain him, but hesitated. Emma dropped the dollar, letting the piggy bank shatter on the floor, coins scattering like fallen stars. Max reached her side and sat, pressing his body against her legs protectively. Emma bent down and wrapped her arms around his neck. No more bids, Bennett said quietly, his voice edged with something final. $75,000. Hammond stared at him, jaw tight, but didn't counter. Sold, the auctioneer announced. To bidder 28 for $75,000. Applause erupted, some out of relief, others from genuine joy. Margaret rushed to Emma, tears spilling freely as she crouched and pulled both her daughter and Max in her arms. Rick followed, a silent guardian now no longer divided. But just as Officer Reynolds reached a hand over the leash, officially, Sheriff Robert Evans stepped forward. Not so fast, he said. The room hushed again. Department policy requires formal decommissioning for a working K-9. Emma can't be his handler. She's a minor. Liability is a serious concern. Policy doesn't cover what just happened, Bennett said calmly, stepping beside Margaret. Evans frowned. I sympathize, but rules exist for a reason. Emma looked up at him. My dad said Max protects people. That's what he does. That's who he is. Bennett placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. Let's take this up with the town council, sheriff. In the meantime, you've got your money. Max goes home tonight. Evans looked between them, eyes hard. Only temporarily. Final placement decision will be made after council review. Margaret felt her knees weaken, but she stayed strong for Emma. For now, Max was coming home. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The hearing room at Silver Creek Town Hall felt more like a courtroom that morning. Rows of folding chairs filled with townsfolk, off-duty officers, reporters, and city officials. All turned toward the front where a long table stood. Behind it sat the town council, Sheriff Evans, and representatives from the district legal board. At the center of the room sat Emma, her fingers curled around Max's leash like it was a lifeline. Margaret sat beside her daughter, spine straight, emotions tucked behind a carefully composed expression. On her other side, Rick adjusted his tie, eyes steady with a new kind of conviction. Across the room, James Hammond was flanked by lawyers in sharp suits, eyes like glass. And standing near the back, arms crossed, was Steve Bennett, quiet but resolute. Councilwoman Teresa Blake began the meeting with a calm voice. This proceeding concerns the placement of K-9 Max, retired service dog, and the petition to assign him into private civilian care with the Carter family. Due to the unique circumstances, we're here to determine if an exception can be made to existing department policy. Sheriff Evans cleared his throat and leaned forward. With all due respect, this is about public safety. Max is highly trained, search and rescue, narcotics, suspect apprehension. These dogs aren't house pets. They require handlers certified by the department. Emma Carter is a minor. Rick stood before anyone else could. I was the one who doubted this from the start, he said, his voice rougher than usual. I thought Emma's connection to Max was unhealthy, that it kept her stuck in the past. But I was wrong. That dog didn't trap her. He brought her back. He's the reason she's speaking again. He looked at Emma, who sat motionless but alert. I tried to stop this, but now I'm here to say I stand with them, with Emma and Margaret. Max belongs with this family. There was a murmur from the crowd. Councilwoman Blake raised her hand. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Martin, can you speak to Emma's current psychological progress? Dr. Martin Winters stepped forward. Emma exhibits symptoms of selective mutism linked to trauma from her father's death. Traditional therapy yielded little change until regular interaction with Max resumed. Her verbal expression, emotional regulation, and trust improved drastically in the presence of this animal. Removing Max now would be profoundly disruptive. The opposing counsel stood. While we sympathize, we must consider long-term liability. There are legal frameworks for a reason. That's when Bennett stepped forward. Then let's change the framework. Heads turned. I've established a trust, he said. It covers training, insurance, therapy, and quarterly evaluations. I've arranged for certified K9 professionals to oversee Max's continued training under Emma's care. This isn't charity. This is responsibility. And Emma is more prepared for that than most adults. Hammond's lawyer jumped in. Mr. Bennett has a personal interest here. Bennett cut him off. My daughter, Sarah, worked at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, the company your client now contracts for. She died 5 years ago, at the same time David Carter was investigating that company. Max was part of that investigation. Hammond isn't here for the dog. He's here to bury what that dog knows. The room went still. Councilwoman Blake raised an eyebrow. Do you have evidence to support that claim? Bennett's attorney stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the table. Internal memos, whistleblower reports, training records, including details of Max's alerts during Deputy Carter's final investigation. Suddenly, this wasn't just a custody debate, it was a scandal. Hammond's legal team tried to object, but the tone of the room had shifted. The council reviewed the documents quickly. Sheriff Evans paled as he skimmed one page. I remember this case, he muttered. David was on something big. Councilwoman Blake leaned forward. Mr. Hammond, your company's continued pursuit of Max despite multiple rejections and the emotional impact on this child is frankly troubling. She turned toward Emma. Miss Carter, would you like to speak? Emma looked up, her voice shaky but audible. Max was my dad's partner. Now he's mine. He keeps me safe and helps me remember. He helps me talk again. I don't want another dog. I want him. A moment of silence. Then the councilwoman nodded. We've heard enough. The council stepped away for deliberation. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Emma sat silently, Max's head resting on her knee. Margaret didn't say a word, but her fingers trembled slightly as they clutched her daughter's shoulder. Finally, the council returned. In light of the extraordinary circumstances, Blake began and the comprehensive measures proposed for Max's care and supervision. The council votes unanimously to approve his permanent placement with the Carter family. The room erupted in applause. Margaret hugged Emma. Rick pressed a kiss to Emma's head, and Max let out a low, contented woof. But Councilwoman Blake wasn't done. Furthermore, Max's status will be updated from retired K9 to certified therapy dog. He will continue working, this time to help children like Emma. Tears streamed freely down Margaret's face. Hammond and his lawyers packed their briefcases in silence as they exited the building. Neighbors lined the walkway, clapping. Reporters leaned in to catch a glimpse of the small girl who'd fought the system and won. That night, back home, Emma curled up on the porch swing. Max lay beside her, ears flicking toward the sound of frogs chirping down by the creek. The air smelled like wildflowers and fresh-cut grass. Margaret brought out hot cocoa. Rick followed, holding a small wrap box. What's this? Emma asked, voice steadier than ever. Rick handed it over. A compass, he said. It was David's. Figure Max helped you find your way again. Might as well have something to guide you forward. Emma held it in her palm, fingers brushing the worn brass edges. You know what Daddy used to say about Max? She whispered. Margaret smiled. Tell me. He said Max could always find what was lost. Emma looked up at the stars, then down at the dog by her side. I think he was right. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.